There's a town that doesn't show up on any map. A mission no one ever confirmed. And a man who erased every trace of his presence before history could record it. But in the cold hours before dawn, he made one final move. A note. A match. And a silence that still echoes. The room was ready, but no one came. The door opened at 3:17 p.m. Moscow time. Not with a bang or with ceremony. Just a quiet turn of the lock and a soft metallic click. The room inside was already warm. Someone had turned on the heat earlier, as instructed. A long rectangular table stretched down the middle. 12 chairs. 12 nameplates. 12 sealed water bottles. Everything was in place. Everything except the people. Putin stood at the threshold for a moment, scanning the room. His eyes paused at each empty chair, each missing face. He didn't ask where they were. He didn't need to. This was a meeting that was never going to happen. It was already dead before it began. Earlier that week, his closest advisor had handed him a list. Not a long one. Just 12 names. Men he had once trusted. Men who had, for years, sat across from him in countless rooms like this. But this time, the intel suggested something different. Something rotten. Not betrayal in the Hollywood sense, no poison pens or flash drives, but whispers, alliances, the slow forming of a parallel center of gravity inside the state. The meeting was a trap. Not for them. For him. But something strange happened. They didn't show up. Not one. Even the guards assigned to escort them, gone. Putin walked to the head of the table and sat down. Alone. He placed a black folder in front of him and flipped it open. Inside, satellite images, transcripts of intercepted calls, financial transfers, and one peculiar memo written in invisible ink, visible only under ultraviolet light. The contents pointed to a pattern. These 12 weren't just ascenders. They were moving as a unit. And their plan was not just to remove him. It was to erase the structure he had spent decades building. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. He picked up one of the water bottles, twisted the cap, and took a slow sip. There was no protocol for this. No plan for what to do when your most trusted inner circle vanishes, not in protest, not in defiance, but in eerie, total silence. Some said it was fear. Others suggested a coordinated disappearance. But there was a third possibility, the one Putin didn't say out loud. That he had already lost them long before this meeting. That this room, perfectly arranged, was just a theater set for a script that no one intended to perform. He stood up after 17 minutes. Left the folder on the table. Walked out without saying a word. 3 hours later, the room was cleared. Not by aides. Not by security. But by a silent team, wearing gloves, collecting every object without leaving a trace. As if the meeting had never been planned. As if nothing had ever happened here at all. The folder that wasn't supposed to leave. The folder was never meant to leave the room. That was the rule. No copies, no scans, no digital footprints. Only eyes on paper and memory in mind. But that night, at exactly 2:41 a.m., someone entered the archive chamber inside Building 5 and removed it. No alarms went off. No cameras recorded movement. The only evidence it ever happened came the next morning, when the fingerprint scanner at the eastern checkpoint registered a failed attempt, followed by a successful override 3 seconds later. The override code belonged to someone who had been dead for 4 months. The folder was gone. By noon, Putin knew. He didn't speak. He didn't ask who. He asked how many people knew it was missing. The answer, 2. Himself. And the intelligence officer who had come to tell him. The officer's hands were shaking. Putin offered him tea. It was cold in the office. The windows hadn't been sealed properly since the renovations last fall. The breeze touched the back of his neck. He hated drafts. What was in the folder wasn't catastrophic. It wasn't nuclear codes or war plans. It was something more dangerous: narratives. 12 interconnected files. Each one tracing the psychological profile, known compromises, silent loyalties, and shifting patterns of behavior of the men who had disappeared. The final page was speculative. It suggested that the absences were rehearsed, coordinated months in advance, and that the real plan wasn't to take him down, but to become him. Not through force, through replication. He's become an idea, the page read. And ideas can be replaced by other ideas. That was the sentence that haunted him. Putin sat for a long time, replaying a memory from 1997. A time when he was nobody. Just a thin man with quiet ambition, riding a tram in St. Petersburg with a plastic bag of groceries and a copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War tucked under his coat. That man wouldn't have understood this moment. He would have laughed at the drama of it all. But he also would have asked the right question: how do you fight something that's designed to look like you, talk like you, think like you, but is the town that wasn't on any map? They arrived at night, under a sky so dark it swallowed the headlights. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then from gravel to dirt. No signs. No lights. Just the endless forest pressing in from both sides. The silence was louder than the engine. Putin leaned forward. How much longer? The driver, a man from the old security services, built like a freezer and twice as cold, didn't look back. 2 minutes. Maybe less. The car finally stopped in front of a rusted gate, chained shut. A small keypad was mounted on a steel post, already covered in frost. The driver typed a code without hesitation. The gate shuddered, then creaked open. Behind it, nothing but darkness. The road continued. Putin said nothing. He knew what this was. The town ahead wasn't on any map. Not in Moscow. Not in archives. Not even in memory. It had been built in the 60s under Khrushchev, then erased under Brezhnev. Only a few ever knew it existed. Even fewer had been allowed in. But Putin? He had been there before. Once. They called it Krasna 9. That wasn't its real name, of course. Just a nickname whispered in field briefings and scribbled on blacked-out documents. It had no birth certificate. No address. No satellite footprint. What it did have was a listening station. A massive one. Buried under meters of reinforced concrete. Fed by stolen American satellites and East German wiretaps. They said it could hear conversations through walls. Through oceans. Through time. As the car pulled into the town's edge, the buildings emerged from the dark like ghosts, concrete cubes with broken windows, peeling paint, and antennas like insect legs stretching into the sky. Not a single light on. Not a single soul moving. And yet, it felt alive. Putin stepped out. The air was dry. Bitter. The kind of cold that made your teeth ache. The driver didn't follow. He wouldn't. He never did. Putin walked down the main road. Past the old post office. Past the hollow school. Past the statue of Lenin that had lost its face to time and weather. He stopped at a door marked with faded red numbers, 103. This was where it had happened. This was where he had heard the voice for the first time. Not on a phone. Not on a tape. But inside his own head. He took a breath and pushed the door open. The inside was untouched. Frozen in time. Ashtrays still on desks. Coffee cups on tables. Maps on the wall with pins and strings that had long since lost their logic. And then, click. A tape recorder. Already playing. No one had pressed it. No one had wound it up. But the voice was clear. Calm. Cold. It said his name. Then, you shouldn't have come back. He froze. The air shifted. The walls seemed to breathe. Something in this place remembered him. Not just his face. Not just his rank. But his choices. His betrayals. His future. The voice continued, repeating the same sentence over and over. You shouldn't have come back. And this time, it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The transmission that never stopped. There was no speaker. No visible power source. No tape left in the reel. And yet the voice kept playing. Putin stared at the recorder. The old model with cracked plastic and a broken rewind button. It shouldn't have worked. Not after 30 years of abandonment. But it did. And the voice, it knew things. Things no living person should remember. You shouldn't have come back. Again. Louder this time. And not from the recorder. From the walls. Putin turned sharply. His breath visible in the air, heart pounding in his chest like a trapped animal. The windows hadn't just frosted over, they'd gone black. As if night had thickened, pressed itself against the glass, refusing to let light back in. And then came the static. Soft at first. Like the hush of a detuned radio. Then sharper. A frequency that felt like it cut through bone. He recognized it. Not the sound, but the pattern. A pulse. 3 short, 2 long, 1 short again. It was a call sign. Soviet era. Discontinued in 1983. Buried under 17 layers of classified archives. He knew because he had signed the order to shut it down. And yet, here it was, broadcasting again. From a station that no longer existed, in a town that wasn't supposed to be real. He followed the sound. Through hallways that seemed to stretch longer than the building allowed. Through doors that hadn't creaked in decades but swung open like they'd been expecting him. At the end was a narrow stairwell. Down he went. Step by step. The static growing louder. Sharper. More alive. The basement was colder than outside. The air metallic. Below zero without frost. That was the first impossible thing. The second, the light. A soft red glow pulsing from the far wall. Not electrical. Organic. Like a heartbeat. And then he saw it, the transmitter. Built into the wall. Not mounted. Fused. Like it had grown there. Wires coiled like veins. A control panel blinking with signals he hadn't seen since East Berlin. And in the center, a single button, worn smooth by time, transmit. He didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, he listened. The voice had changed. Now it was his. Old recordings of his speeches played backward. His private meetings, distorted and layered. His thoughts, ones he'd never said aloud, whispered back to him, looped in patterns that made no sense and too much sense all at once. The machine was remembering for him. Or to him. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was louder than the static. A light blinked green. Someone had answered. But no one had sent a message. The wall hissed. A mechanical slide unlocked. And there, behind a glass panel, was a file. His file. Marked with a code he hadn't seen in years. Directive 74Z. He reached for it. The moment his fingers touched the folder, the room groaned. The wires tightened. The air crackled. And a new voice filled the room. One he hadn't heard since his second year in the KGB. His old handler. Long dead. It said, the transmission never stopped. We just stopped listening. The note he burned before dawn. He sat motionless in the dark, the dull orange tip of his cigarette barely flickering. The walls of the safe house were thin, He could hear the groan of pipes, the shuffle of old slippers on worn floors above him. It was almost dawn, and he knew this would be his final moment of silence. On the table before him was a single folded note. The paper was coarse. Soviet issue. He had written it hours ago in a rush, not trusting memory to keep the details straight. There were names on that list. Places. Instructions. But the most dangerous part wasn't what was written, it was the implications. If anyone else read it, it wouldn't just compromise him. It would start something that couldn't be undone. There had been whispers that the Americans were closer than ever. That the walls were closing in. That someone from the KGB's own ranks had spoken to the West. Putin didn't know if the rumors were true, but he knew how rumors worked. They became evidence faster than facts. He remembered the call he'd gotten the night before. No names, just static and a voice saying, "Not here. Not anymore. You're exposed." He had asked nothing in return. Just listened. Then hung up. Now, his eyes traced the words one last time. He took a breath, then struck a match. The flame reached the corner of the paper, slow at first, hesitant. Then fast. Violent. The list curled and blackened, the ink vanishing into smoke. He watched until only ash remained, his hands steady. From outside, a distant engine rumbled. Not close enough to fear, but not far enough to ignore. He stood up, brushed the ash into a tin, and closed the window. When he turned, his face was different. Not colder. Not harder. Just resolved. He wasn't the same man who had arrived in this forgotten border town 2 months ago. That man was cautious, calculating. This one was prepared. Putin folded his coat over his arm, slid the tin into a hidden pocket, and walked out into the morning haze. No one saw him leave. Just as no one had seen him arrive. And if anyone asked, years from now, in some hearing or trial or hushed backroom, they'd say there was never a man like that in this town. No name. No record. No footprints left in snow. Just silence. And a note that never existed. And that was the note he burned before dawn, the final piece in a puzzle that history never acknowledged. If this story made you question what you thought you knew, there's more where that came from. Subscribe to Hidden Chapters for more untold moments, and don't forget to share this with someone who still believes everything is documented. Until next time, stay